Pronunciation.
Pronunciation Pro.
Pronunciation Pro.
Hello again. Welcome to today's episode of Pronunciation Pro. I'm Annie Rudin, your guide on this journey to become a more confident English communicator. Today's topic is one that hits home for many of you: the overwhelming need to sound perfect when you're speaking English, especially if you're a high achiever. So let me ask you this. Have you ever found yourself holding back in a conversation or in a meeting because you're afraid of making a mistake? You're comparing your English pronunciation to a native speaker's, or even to how fluent you are in your own language. You're practicing, you've practiced for hours, but when it's time to speak up, you freeze. Your heart starts racing and you think, well, what if I don't sound perfect? What if they judge me? Well, if that sounds familiar, then this episode is for you. We're going to talk about the trap of perfectionism and why it's keeping so many of us from speaking up, and most importantly, how to break free from it. Let's start with the core issue, which is perfectionism. If you're a high achiever, chances are you hold yourself to an incredibly high standard. And when it comes to speaking English, you might feel like anything less than perfect isn't good enough. But here's the problem. Perfectionism doesn't push you to get better. It actually holds you back. I've seen this with so many of my students. They compare themselves to native English speakers, or even worse, to their own fluency in their native language. So I had one student, a very successful engineer, who was incredibly knowledgeable. But whenever it came time to present in English, she would freeze. She'd practiced every word and sound, but the fear of not sounding native enough completely shut her down. So this is where comparison becomes a problem. It's something that Brené Brown, who I love so much, Brené Brown talks about this in her research on perfectionism. She calls perfectionism a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking it will protect us. But really, it's the thing that's holding us down. So the exact quote from Brené Brown is, "Perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking that it will protect us, when in fact, it's the thing that's really preventing us from taking flight." And that's from the book, The Gift of Imperfection, which I highly recommend. Okay, so why do we do this to ourselves? Why do we obsess over sounding perfect, even to the point where we don't speak at all? Well, it's about belonging. Okay, our brains are wired, and I've talked about this many times in this podcast, but our brains are wired to seek connection and acceptance. It's how we survive as a species. Thousands of years ago, being part of a group meant safety. If you were isolated, your chances of survival were very slim. Okay, even today, that instinct to belong is so strong. When you speak English with an accent, or when you make a mistake, you might feel different, like you don't belong. You don't fully belong. This triggers a fear of exclusion. That fear is powerful. It can stop you in your tracks. Okay, neuroscientist Matthew Lieberman actually talks about this in his book called Social: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Connect. He explains that our brains experience social pain, like feeling excluded, the same way we experience physical pain. That's why it feels so intense. Okay, so Lieberman's quote says, "Our brains are wired to connect, and when we don't feel that connection, we experience it as pain." So when you're worried about how you sound, or whether people will judge you for your accent, that fear of not belonging gets in the way of our ability to communicate. But here's the downside. Striving for perfection, or striving for perfect pronunciation, can actually hurt your progress. I've seen this time and time again. So one of my students spent hours practicing pronunciation at home. She had a great accent, but every time there was an opportunity to speak speak in public, she avoided it. Why? Because she thought that she didn't sound absolutely perfect, people would judge her. By avoiding those opportunities, she was actually stalling her improvement. When we're so focused on perfection, we really miss out on real world practice. The kind of practice that's messy and full of mistakes, but actually leads to real growth. So I want you to reframe how you think about mistakes. Instead of viewing them as something to be afraid of, start seeing them as a part of the learning process. So I had another student who did exactly this. She embraced her mistakes, spoke up more often, and as a result, she made faster progress than she ever had before. Okay? Another big reason why my students hold back is the fear of judgment. So this is huge, especially in professional settings. One student told me she always felt like people would think less of her because of her accent. But after participating in more meetings, she realized something very profound, that most people don't care how she sounded. They cared about what she was saying. Okay? Most people don't care how you sound. They care about what you're saying. The content of your idea is what matters most. Of course, we have to have the pronunciation skills and, to be able to be clearly understood. But at a certain point, it doesn't matter that much. Okay? People are more concerned about what you have to say. Okay? Another Brene Brown quote that I love says, vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Truth and courage aren't always comfortable, but they're never weakness. So speaking up, even when you know you're not perfect, is an act of courage. Every time you do it, you get stronger, more confident, and more skilled. So how do we break free from this this perfection trap? The first step is to shift your focus from perfection to progress. Your goal shouldn't be to sound perfect. It should be to communicate clearly and to connect with people you're speaking to. Every conversation is an opportunity to improve. So second, practice self-compassion. It's okay to make mistakes. In fact, I encourage you to make them. The more you allow yourself to be imperfect, the more confident you'll become. And finally, embrace a growth mindset. If you believe that your abilities, like your pronunciation, can improve with time and effort, you'll be more likely to take risks and push yourself outside your comfort zone. Carol Dweck's research on growth mindset shows that when we believe our abilities can be developed, we become more resilient and willing to tackle challenges. Okay, I want to share a quick story with you. One of my students was terrified of speaking up in meetings. She would practice her pronunciation endlessly, but avoided every opportunity to actually speak in front of other people. But then something shifted. She decided to start speaking up, even if it wasn't perfect. Okay, fast forward a few months, and the same student led an entire team meeting in English. She wasn't perfect, but she was confident, and that's what made the difference. She received praise for her ideas and communication skills, not because she sounded flawless, but because she spoke with confidence. That's the transformation I want for each one of you. So here are my final takeaways. You do not need to sound perfect to be an effective communicator. I'm going to say that again. You do not need to sound perfect to be an effective communicator. Even in this podcast episode, I've stumbled over words and I've, had to start and restart. It just happens. It's not about flawless pronunciation. It's about connection with others. It's about being clear. and having the courage to speak up. If you take one step today, let it be this. The next time you have an opportunity to speak, whether it's in a meeting with a colleague or even practicing on your own, let go of the need to be perfect. Focus on expressing your ideas. Focus on connection with that other person. Remember, the courage to be imperfect opens the door to true growth. Are you willing to be imperfect in your spoken English? I know you're doing it every day. My students at Pronunciation Pro are doing it every single day. Okay? So you're already doing it. Now, can you push yourself one step further and doing it a little bit more, or giving yourself a little bit more compassion? Okay? Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you found this episode helpful, I'd love for you to share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And as always, keep practicing, keep speaking, and most of all, keep showing up as your authentic self. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.
Pronunciation
Pronunciation Pro.
Pronunciation Pro.